Thank you. Thank you. Both a pleasure and an honor to be here. Also upsetting because I had the great pleasure of going with Helen and Ray, and I think Helen's in the audience, to Bathurst and actually seeing kangaroos in the wild. And there was a particular place we went to where they were rehabilitating them, finding injured babies, bringing them in, and then releasing them to the wild, which is the best possible outcome. And these animals, I went with my family, and it was just so touching and moving. These little teeny joeys would come up and put their hands on you and look up at you, and the eyes are just like dogs. And you'd see the love, and you think, how could anybody bring themselves to hurt these animals? And how could anybody talk about them as a pest, or as what are the other words you use? Vermin, what an awful word. Vermin coming from the Latin, a worm. And by the way, Darwin was very interested in worms at the end of his life. They're fascinating, he said, earthworms, they keep us alive. But the idea that people would demonize them in that way, and I guess I just want to learn from you. I know nothing about this. And an American coming here and thinking, oh, they're going to love them the way they love koalas, and everybody will respect them and treat them with enormous compassion and love, and nobody would ever permit them to be killed. It'd be absolutely illegal, of course. It'd be like killing an American eagle. You know what would happen in America if you killed the bald eagle? So here we have three of the world's experts on this, and yes, I want to find out, how did we get here? What does this mean? Why that language? How many are killed? And why? And feel free to just jump in. Mark, I'm sure you all have lots of opinions about this. But maybe we should find out, Dan, how many are actually, what are we talking about? I mean, it's not dozens, right?
No, it's not dozens. So the commercial industry has routinely killed, I guess on average, about 3 million kangaroos a year, and that's of 4 or so main species on the mainland. We don't have current statistics for the last couple of years because they're not being publicised by the Australian government. So we're yet to find out what numbers have been killed in the last couple of years. However, it's the commercial industry, which is the killing of kangaroos for meat and skins and fur and so forth. But there's also the killing of kangaroos for under this pest status, and there are no records kept of how many are killed under that centrally. So we've FOI'd that information and come back with nothing. There's a hell of a lot of illegal killing. So it's just commonplace. When I travel and speak to farmers, a lot of our research at UTS is based working with farmers and local communities, and they openly admit to illegally killing kangaroos. It's not even a hidden thing. It's just acknowledged. Well, you don't want to have to bother with the paperwork. And
does the public accept this?
Well, that's a good question. There is obviously this cultural acceptance of this, and often we talk about the explicit harm that we sanction towards animals that we could consider as pests. So if something's a pest and we want to remove it, whether it's a fox or a cat or a pig or a dog or something like this, we spend money and we kill them. But there's also this implicit harm that that explicit harm makes permissible, which is all the illegal killing, the shooting of ravens, the killing of wedge-tailed eagles. Many farmers poison wedge-tailed eagles because they think that they take their lambs. I mean, it's just commonplace. So this is entrenched. I mean, kangaroos, yes, are really, really copying it, but this really reflects our entire attitude to sharing space with nature.
Could I just ask a question about the numbers? Because it often does come up in this debate. I was told recently that there's a quota, but only about 2% of the quota is actually being killed. And I understand when it comes to fisheries that the kill amount reflects the actual numbers. So is that 2% real, and does it reflect that the numbers are low?
Okay, so There's lots of things in there. So for those who don't know, there are methods that are used by the government to assess the total number of kangaroos that occur. They do that by flying planes over transects across New South Wales. They fly over these areas and they have people on either side of the plane and they count the numbers that they see. They then work out the area that they've surveyed and the total area available, and nothing is excluded, and then they calculate a population estimate for that entire area. They then set what is considered to be a sustainable yield. So it's this idea of how many can you kill in a given year without allowing their population to crash. Obviously the intention with pest killing is to make them crash, but in the commercial industry there are guidelines around that. Now, in every year that we have government statistics for, they have never killed the quota. This can be from a range of things. Maybe because there weren't enough shooters or so forth to actually do that, but we don't think that's the case. We think actually the problem here is the fact that the numbers that they're estimating in these landscapes are actually far less. So there are problems with the way in which they're counting. And so this quota, you could say, okay, they're not killing, if they think that there are 100,000 and they only allow to killing of 15,000, but they're really only killing 2, that's okay because we haven't impacted. But there's a lot of debate about whether that 100,000 is actually the correct number.
Do we know, in fact, how many kangaroos there are in all of Australia? Is there any?
No, the answer is no.
We don't know.
No, and in fact, I wrote an article in the Conversation just last year talking about the fact that there is this great unknown, and there is some debate among scientists. Some scientists say that there are more kangaroos today than at the time of settlement. There are other scientists, and I include myself in one of them, that think that actually they've suffered considerable decline. And I and my research team and many of the students at UTS and elsewhere are now doing research looking at where are these gaps. There's huge swathes of the landscape where kangaroos are now absent, whether it's for cities or agriculture and so forth. So we're talking about a group of species, and there's about 60 odd species of kangaroos. But these the big ones, these top 4, have really suffered some decline.
Well, I saw that, sorry, just one second. When I went up to Bathurst from the Blue Mountains, we were looking because our 14-year-old, I want to see a kangaroo. And we only saw 2 dead ones on the road. And then we got to Bathurst and I was taken for a 20-kilometer ride where they might be, and we didn't see any.
You know the story of Darwin when he came in 1830 and he rode on horseback from Sydney to Bathurst, he didn't see a single kangaroo.
It was the same when the Russians came here to review they'd had a ban in place, already in place in 2009, and the industry brought them out to try and convince them that, you know, you need to open up this industry again because it actually crippled the industry by reducing 70% of exports. And I remember Sergei Yushin saying, I have not seen one kangaroo in this country which is apparently overrun with kangaroos. So, and I think this goes to the original question as to why have we arrived at this point where there is this mindset about kangaroos. And I think, and actually you helped me in your answer there, I actually think that the machine of spin doctoring and pushing out the message, the wrong message, from the industries, which are the meat industries and the grain industries, has been very successful. We probably could learn from it. And they have managed to get most Australians think that kangaroos must be removed, their numbers must be reduced because there is this conflict between agribusiness and the wildlife, the kangaroos. But I think the linchpin, and this is what's happened in many other industries, is that most people who would have that view, who've been convinced by this lie, most people would not agree with what happens to these animals. Most people don't know actually what happens when that shooter loads up gets his truck ready, hits the road and starts the killing. Or what the farmer does when the farmers cannot get the shooters to come on to the properties, and this is what's happening with this crisis over male kill, which we'll go to later, they will just go out and blast away at the kangaroos because they themselves have also been conditioned to form a view that this animal must be removed, otherwise there'll be no meat, there'll be no wheat, there'll be no sheep, there'll be no wool. So they've been, and the people have, and so that's been communicated through to the average Australians that if we don't do this, there'll be a crisis. It's a bit like what the egg industry did when the campaign started to remove battery cages. There'll be no eggs. It's the same that they said when, if we're to ban live export, then the economy will crash and there'll be no jobs. Or spin doctoring, nonsense lies. So part of what it is to turn it around by showing people, as we did, the battery cage, and they say, I want eggs, but I don't want eggs from animals that are kept in confinement like that. Then if the average people can see what it is happening to the female, the does, how the animals are shot, how they're uncleanly shot. It's not happening in the daytime, it's happening at night under long strobe lights, and it's very difficult to see if you've killed the animal correctly and what happens to the young. Once that information is becoming clear and we can communicate that, I think most people will come with us to turning this whole thing around.
I'm shocked that they would actually use the word, as I heard from you, of decapitation of babies. I mean, when we see that in the newspaper about ISIS, everyone is horrified that how can they just talk about it so openly?
Well, we've got to that point of numbness, and that's been their advantage. So we have to turn that numbness into sensitivity of the issues.
What do they mean by decapitation? I guess it's not a very obscure word, but
cutting off the head.
They really mean that. But why?
Well, it's considered to be it's in the context of what was the process that was used before. So if you shot a female, and you go up to the female and she has a young in the pouch and maybe one at foot, and about 50% of the time she may have two. 75% of the time she may have one in pouch. So if it's this small, you used to be able to take it out and just bash its head against the bull bar of the vehicle or something else that's blunt. And that's a pretty ugly picture. So then the next stage I thought, well, just cut its head off and that would be more acceptable. That's what the argument is. But of course the one at foot hops away. They can't get to that younger one, and that kangaroo will die from starvation, predation, or exposure. So probably 50 to 75% of the time when the shooter shoots a doe, he or she is shooting 3 animals.
And I guess the issue there is because it's, as Mark was saying, because it's at night, it's in the bush, it's often just a lone shooter. There's no enforcement of the regulation, and it's very common for shooters to just ignore the pouch young because it's horrific, even for them, to bash this baby, so they pull them out and leave them. And so they'll dive.
And that's the key. It's 300, 400, 500, 700, maybe 1,000 kilometres out in the outback. Night time. So it's not like the seals and the baby harp seals on the white snow, broad daylight, cameras flashing, front page of the Sunday Telegraph, which caused that crisis years ago, as we know. So this is a hidden evil, and that's the other dilemma. It's hidden, and it's very difficult to get those images out there to show people exactly what's going on.
Lee, why would the government accept this? What's in it for them?
Well, there's certainly nothing in it for the public, financially or morally. I think there's a number of things that come out of the conversation that we're having. I think it's worth, just before we get on to governments, why we've ended up at this stage. Because I don't think we were always at the point where it's as bad as it is now. There was a Senate inquiry back in the 1970s in the federal parliament. And at that stage, I think most Australians would be horrified at the thought that kangaroo species could become extinct in this country. And my guess is, I wasn't around at that time, but that's why that inquiry was held then. It would be very hard to get the numbers for such an inquiry now. But then what you see is that I think that then the word is starting to develop that there is a problem in the way that, what's happening with our kangaroos. And then the kangaroo industry starts to become very powerful. And we have a party here, it used to be called the Country Party, now called the National Party, who say they represent farming interests. They absolutely don't. They represent just a certain section, and I wouldn't even call them farmers. They're industrial farmers, big agribusinesses. And this isn't a huge agribusiness either. We were just talking together before we came. There's only about 3 companies involved. But
really?
yeah, but these people are well connected. They put their money into lobbying, into pushing for certain support. And the support the kangaroo industry gets is considerable. There's a real merging between the industry and the government, and that's very well reflected on what happened in California recently. But I'll just go back to the 1970s, because then there was a ban in Australia on the export of kangaroo products to the US. Now that was lifted after pressure from the industry. But interestingly, this ban was retained in California. And then just there was a push to get that lifted. And the kangaroo industry, with a lot of support from Australian government sources, pushed to get that lifted. And they got support to the very top levels of Australian government, right up to the former ambassador, Australian ambassador in the US, Kim Beazley, former leader of the Labor Party. I understand that he actually went to California to lobby the legislators there. Our office did a lot of work with the legislators and the researchers there, and myself and others wrote letters. I'm very proud that we actually were able to help the people there who were horrified at the story. In some ways, it's like if you're more distant, you don't see these animals as pests. It's like we've reacted, and Mark's given the example of the seals. I mean, many of us could remember decades ago of seeing that and thinking, how could you do that? And that's what I think has happened in California. At any rate, the end of the story is that after a lot of pressure from the Australian government, tied up with the kangaroo industry, they kept the ban in place. So that's a good news story. But meanwhile here, it's a very unhealthy, immoral situation, with just a few operators who are then making the profits, because the people that Mark's met and described, I don't imagine those shooters make much money.
No.
Yeah.
Very little.
Yeah, they make very little money.
They're in the middle of it, just like the animals.
Yeah, and they'd be country boys. That's what they would have grown up. They probably have few skills, and that's how they get some income. And meanwhile, the cruelty it's just breathtaking. So the problem, coming back to the government, the federal government, its intersection with the kangaroo industry is really to drive the export industry. That is what the federal government does. At a state level, they're supposed to address issues around animal welfare and conservation. But you really, when you look into it, you start to see they don't do that, and they're really, at the end of the day, it ends up helping what the kangaroo industry and the federal government's doing is in further driving the export industry, or just this general killing and culling, whatever people call it. So again,
So this is where it comes in very handy of getting somebody elected into the state government.
Yes.
Because in New South Wales, we're just about to have the kangaroo management plan reviewed. Well, it's actually being reviewed. And that happens about every 4 to 5 years. So this year, my minister, your minister, Mr. Speakman, has to sign off on a kangaroo management plan, which is really a plan to kill maybe up to 4, 5, 6 million kangaroos in New South Wales. And so he's getting advice from his own department, from the National Parks and Wildlife Service. But being in the House gives the opportunity to go and see him. And unfortunately, Uncle Max isn't here. But I had the opportunity to take a wonderful elder, Max Duraluminum, who's an elder whose icon totem is the kangaroo. So he is the kangaroo. So I took the kangaroo to meet Mr. Speakman. And so we talked about all the animal welfare issues and many other issues, but the crowning issue for the minister, which is where he did actually start to seriously take notice, is where Uncle Max said, I'm the kangaroo Indigenous people are connected to this animal. We have laws and lores connected with these animals, just like in the Mabo situation where the Indigenous people have laws and lores connected with the land. We are connected to the animals, and if you sign off on the killing of me and my people's connection and deep and profound connection to these animals, then you are signing off on the killing of us and are going against our laws. So he's got 3 weeks to respond as to whether I've asked him to send the kangaroo management plan, or actually the killing of kangaroos generally, to a specific committee in New South Wales so that the whole industry can be reviewed, where we can call everybody, including all the shooters that have told us what's been going on. But the new factor, which now the government's going to have to take into account, is this connection with Indigenous people and the kangaroo and their relationship with it, and how they have never been consulted, and how the Indigenous people should have a say, and probably the final say. So things are possible. So we'll see what happens.
And would he represent, in fact, the view of Indigenous people?
He and as many other elders as possible would be called. Yeah.
Fantastic.
Well, I was just going to say, Mark, that one of the issues is that the commercial killing industry is only one component of the ways in which these animals are persecuted. So they're hit on roads and they're trapped in fences and they're killed illegally and then they're killed as pests. And what we find in places where when the industry has struggled, that there's been just a switch between allowing shooters for the commercial industry onto the properties to killing under pest licence. So one of the things that rings true all the time is the kangaroos are shot, regardless of whether it's for a commercial industry or not. And so we have quite a broad, it's quite I find it a lot more complex. When I'm speaking to farmers, and basically it's their land, they love being in the bush and they love animals and so forth, but an animal on their land has to earn its keep. And if it doesn't earn its keep, it needs to get off. And that's just the way that they see it. And I can appreciate that from their point of view to some degree. But we have to find solutions for them to how they understand and contemplate and share space with kangaroos.
But Dan, to what extent are the kangaroos actually harming land?
So that's a really good question, Jeffrey. When we've done science on this, and we've done lots and lots of science under a range of different conditions, we find that kangaroos, for the most part, don't compete very much with sheep and cattle. They eat a lot less, they hardly drink, they avoid areas where there are sheep and cattle. They don't like to be next to them. So if there are sheep in your pasture, there won't be any kangaroos. They're avoiding them. They eat different plants.
So is this a perception problem?
Very much so.
Yes.
Yeah.
I'll be a bit of a devil's advocate there, though. So there's that problem as well. We have to help to change this mindset of farmers automatically assuming that these are competition. But my devil's advocate scenario is drought, a sudden drought, thousands of kangaroos, and the agribusiness wanting to survive. And one would have to, at a certain point, assume, yes, there is now a competition. And so my question is, that's going to be the next thing that we'll have to work out an answer to. How do we actually solve that problem? Now, I put it once to the Minister for the Environment, why don't we just do food drops for the kangaroos at that time and help them out and help them through the drought, just as we do for livestock?
I think Mark's actually raising a huge issue for Australia, and that is our farming practices sustainable?
Sustainable.
Right.
That's something,
question,
yes, that is barely, if ever, discussed in this country, because we have these hoofed animals that do so much destruction to our very fragile soils and fragile plants. And so that's a discussion that is very much needed. It's been needed for hundreds of years since we were first colonised and invaded, but now with climate change it's absolutely needed, and it's relevant to what Mark says. When I'm in debates with some of the senators What they just carry on about is you've never seen all these hundreds of kangaroos at the water hole, and that it's competing with the animals. So that is coming up more and more. But I think that's how I actually answer that, is that I'm not denying what they're seeing, but just because you're getting hundreds of kangaroos at a water hole or along the road where there's more green grass means often that in other parts of the landscape it is denuded. There isn't kangaroos there anymore, except they've gathered in certain places, and it can actually be another demonstrator that there is collapse of populations going on. And I think that's why we do need some really solid research done about this, because at the moment, we don't have that.
I think, Lee, we do have good science around... No, we do need more research. We do have good science around the competition during drought, and there's no doubt that that kangaroos do aggregate when the land has been over-farmed and becomes depauperate. Then you do get animals coming together in places, but then they disperse, and it's not a good situation. But kangaroos are adapted to these kinds of conditions, and they have evolved a strategy around that. So we see a lot of decline in kangaroo populations.
And isn't the problem that when they send out the troops to do the so-called count, they do the count where all the kangaroos in a difficult time have congregated to be able to count?
Right, and
the
suddenly
numbers
they see
again.
200.
We're overwhelmed
times,
because
yes.
there are 5,000 around some source of water, where in the next 300, 500 kilometres there's 2. But they don't go count them.
No, so I think one of the issues is, you're right, with this, we don't see the kinds of mobs that the early settlers saw. So they really did see mobs of thousands when they were going through the landscape. I can tell you in 21 years of working with kangaroos, I've never seen that, ever, anywhere. The issue is that in terms of research, we need to develop better climate resilient practices for using and engaging in the land. We've just heard this week calls for changing farming practices to protect the Great Barrier Reef. And yes, that's a difficult thing to contemplate, and many people find it difficult. If they've worked on the land and they passed it down, and their great-grandfather and their grandfather and their father did things that way, it's hard to challenge them. And yet we need that discussion, and that's the kind of research that we need. That's the kind of the research that we're doing at UTS. We're working with communities who realise that something's broken, and that the stocking rates for their sheep is far lower than what their fathers and grandfathers had, and they cannot get them up, and they don't have a strategy for doing that. And the kangaroo is really superb, not superfluous. Yeah, but it's not.
Is it a scapegoat here?
A scapegoat, and it's not really achieving anything.
Not a goat, but
like the killing, when they aggregate in numbers, that's when the farmer will call in his mate, either for a pest or a commercial shooter. But it's not really changing the fact that these landscapes have been pillaged, and there's no way back. And that's where we need to be focusing our attention.
And I mean, kangaroos evolved to live here.
That's right.
Nowhere to find the water. Even I think you suggested, and maybe you can tell us a bit more, that they use far less than a sheep. I mean, we all know how much a cow uses. Every day in a newspaper we read to make, one hamburger, you need 10,000 liters of water. That's insane.
Sure.
So it's very interesting that in the budget estimates, I was able to ask the Minister a question which floored him, because he didn't have the answer, and it was bleedingly obvious we needed to have the answer. And the question was, in all this analysis of degradation of the environment and protected species, etc., has there ever been an analysis, and I was talking about the demonising of cats and foxes and introduced species, has there been an analysis of what is the difference of the impact on wildlife and the environment between agribusiness and its practices versus the introduction of wild animals or even native animals? Has there actually been an analysis as to what activity causes more damage and loss of habitat and loss of animals
And the answer?
It's us.
No.
It's us. No.
That's amazing.
It is absolutely amazing because all this energy which you're talking about goes into the demonizing of animals,
Yeah.
but it's the old trick. Find a culprit, which
Yeah.
is an illusion, blame them, and then we don't have to actually do anything where we are.
We still
Look,
have extremely high clearance rates, land clearance rates.
We still have what?
Land clearance
Clearance
rates
rate, yeah.
extremely high, particularly in Queensland, in New South Wales as well. So we're still allowing these practices to go on. And really, I mean, I know this is not our topic, but cats and foxes are put up there as this great impact on Australia's
And it's
small
not actually
mammals,
true.
but it's not true.
minimal compared to how many
Wow.
birds are in that tree which is felled compared to how many the cats have taken in the last month.
Now, I don't know if you saw today on the BBC, 5 people sent it to me, this horrifying story about a single shooter on Kings Island who shot 33,000 kangaroos. I was on the BBC, it was on the headlines of the BBC, and I was shocked. And they mentioned Voiceless trying to do something about it. You must have seen it, Brian. But,
3,000? How
and the idea was that they had to get rid of all the kangaroos on this island. But
We are notorious for slaughter, and I think one thing that we do know that Australia has the highest rate of loss of mammals of any country in the world.
really,
Yes, and when we're talking about the mammals here, it's all those unique marsupials. It's quite unbelievable that there isn't more outrage. I think it's a pleasure to hear yourself, being concerned and being outraged. And we're a pretty laid-back country, and then it's strange. Although there's actually very few people who are farmers and on the land. There is a culture that's grown up about we are a country of the land, and what farmers need, farmers get, and what farmers, you respect that. They get incredible levels of subsidies during droughts, which you feel for. We've all spoken about that tonight, but sooner or later we've really got to grapple with this issue of how we're using our own country.
Dan, is it possible that you'll wind up like America, where the wolf is practically gone, and yet, or even worse, whereas in Norway, where there are no wolves, and there haven't been for, 70 years, and if you ask the population, what are you most afraid of, they answer, wolves. There are no wolves to be afraid of.
They're a werewolf.
Werewolf, right.
Well, there's really...
Could we reach that situation in
Yeah, well,
Australia?
there's nowhere in Australia where dingoes are free from 1080.
Free from?
1080, which is the
1080
poison that's used to kill
Oh, God.
everything, really. Whether it's ravens or eagles or kangaroos or pigs or dogs, that's what we use. So the Australian landscape is interesting in some respects because we've lost a number of species more than anywhere else. We've also gained more than anywhere else. So we have now wild populations of camels. There are now wild camels for the first time in 2,000 years in Australia.
And we export.
Do they harm anything?
Depends who you ask.
That's contentious. They also benefit things. So all species, every individual animal, wherever it is, whatever it does, interacts with others.
Sure.
And this idea of impact and harm is really a value that you place on that. So if a herbivore eats a plant, is that evil? If a lion eats a person, is it evil? Right? These are things that carnivores and so forth do. So I guess in the Australian landscape, it's very, very interesting. We have dingoes which came down from Indonesia 4,000 or 5,000 years ago. We had thylacines, which they now have evidence that they were in some form of domesticated relationship with the Indigenous people.
Really?
Many years ago. And so there's been radical changing. Now, kangaroos do okay. They're, for the most part, most of them, because of their size, are able to withstand human globalisation in this Anthropocene that we're in, right? But we don't see that as a value that's worthwhile. We focus our attention on these extinct species that are extinct, that are declining. If there's 100 northern hairy-nosed wombats left, we pump millions of dollars into protecting them. but we don't care about hundreds of thousands or millions of kangaroos that are shot in this inhumane way. And there's a fragmentation of the way in which we're really engaging with nature. So Australia's unique, in a sense, in the way in which its fauna has dramatically changed relative to other places in the world. But we, as a colonial, for the most part, colonial society, have failed to adapt. We still form that kind of acclimatisation society approach where we tried to make Australia look like Europe, to make us feel comfortable. And that's fundamentally the problem. That's where we start to need our politicians and our sociologists and all these other people to start really engaging in how is it that Australia is going to share space with the kangaroos and the other wildlife that live here.
Well, that is the question, Lee and Mark. How did this happen that a government goes along with this? If it's such a small industry, how do they allow themselves to be lobbied as if they were Washington, D.C.? Where there's a lot of money involved.
The farmer is God.
The farmer is God.
That's what I was saying.
So if you want your seat, most of the seats are in rural areas, not city. So if the farmers are of a mindset and a delusion that these animals are noxious and must be killed, if you were to suddenly, and that's your seat, or your government has a lot of seats there, your party, and you start to bring in policies or suggest policies of changing that mindset, there's fear, correct me if I'm wrong, that you will lose government.
Now, how did they get to the point where they made the farmers believe that this is dangerous to you? They must have lived for hundreds of years with them without fearing that, right?
Oh, look, I think it's what we spoke about earlier, that farmers, and I think Dan put it very well and very sympathetically, that a point would come when some of these farmers would see that there's competition. And I think that there, at times in some drought situations, there probably is, like there's complexities in any ecosystem. So I agree with what Mark said, but I think there's been an overlay of it that now there's really power. We're talking about big money. It's not a lot of money. I think it's a bit different from some of the other big battles that society is dealing with. But these people, we've got a National Party and a Liberal Party, and largely the Labor Party won't challenge on these issues, even though it's a party more of the city. It just doesn't deal effectively with these issues or with any meaning or dedication. So there's one aspect of it is like what farmers want, farmers get, and we've just sort of gone along with that and haven't questioned it. But now you've got big money, they'd probably wine and dine, you get the impression, with the politicians. They're down in Canberra. Some of the main lobby group is sort of like half government, half industry. And so there's an entwining there. And that's what the federal government's responsibility is about, developing this as an industry. It's about developing the export industry. That's why they were over there fighting so hard to get that ban lifted in California. It wasn't, for just no reason. It was about expanding in, and that's again the work, like Animal Liberation. I pay great credit to them in terms of like the work that Mark did in effectively stopping the Russian trade. Was huge. Like that was one of the most incredibly significant campaign, and the industry knows there's a battle going on. They're watching what we're doing.
And how about your own party, Lee? I know you've had a lot of conflict with members of the Green Party who you would think would be totally on your side on this.
Yes, I wouldn't say it's severe conflict, but I certainly acknowledge that there's a debate around about the commercialisation of wildlife. So people would be horrified about the way the animals are killed, etc. But there are some people who are caught up, and sometimes former Professor Michael Archer's name comes up in this. I actually studied zoology when he was one of our lecturers, so it's been interesting to watch how that's played out. But there's people like Michael who develop this argument that some people think is plausible, that the way to save animals is by the commercialisation, which I think is just incredibly dangerous, incredibly wrong. And there's certainly a number of us within the Greens who continue to work for there to be ban on the commercialisation of wildlife.
We had to destroy the city to save it.
Yes.
I was just going to add, if I may, I was just going to add to that there's this idea that's one of the reasons why in the Greens movement, in the conservation movement, there has been acceptance of the killing of wildlife for conservation purposes, particularly in relation to kangaroos, is the fact that the argument that sheep and cattle have really damaged, the farming that we've done has really damaged the landscape. And that perhaps one way back would be to remove sheep and cattle from the land, and if we're going to eat meat, why don't we eat something that was actually here and it's evolved and it's adapted? There are and another issue that gets raised is the idea that they don't produce a lot of greenhouse gases. So whereas one of the biggest contributors worldwide is cattle to carbon emission, greenhouse emissions, that would be a reduction in that. So surely it's a great thing that if we switch to eating kangaroo, we'd have all these wins. The problem is it just doesn't work. So when you sit down and you go through the arguments and you say they produce there's hardly any meat on them, they're very slow breeders, they're very sparse in the landscape. In order for everybody to have be able to switch, you would just need to have millions and millions and millions of them in the landscape. It's actually a ridiculous argument.
And they don't,
but it's been
they don't step up onto the truck to
yes,
go into
yes,
slaughter.
They jump over the fences.
So never mind.
Not domesticated.
No. So never mind the welfare issues,
That's a huge issue, moving them.
Never mind the welfare issues, and there really is, as it's been said, there is general consensus that the welfare issues around the killing is incredibly poor, and there's not much that could be improved.
A couple of positive things I
Yep,
can
go.
add. If you want, I thought you might want something positive in terms of where there's some work being done. Well, I think one great thing that's come out of the summit in Paris on climate change is that finally they acknowledge that agribusiness contributes to global warming more than the transport system of the whole world.
Yes.
So that is gold.
Yeah.
And finally they got to that point. But we have the Russian ban, which seriously crippled the industry. Now the industry mainly relies on Europe. We've had 3 meetings with all of the political parties, animal political parties from Europe and other countries, and this year the Dutch Party for Animals in Holland will be introducing debate, motion and a bill to ban the imports of kangaroo products into Holland.
Fantastic.
And if we have 3 or 4 more countries, they'll get it. And if we have 3 or 4 more member countries of the EU implement such a ban, and at our meeting in Tirana in Albania, we realised it could be a country that doesn't even import kangaroo meat products now. It doesn't matter. So when you get that, just like the baby harp seal issue for Europe, once you have 5 countries, or about 5 countries, then the EU has to address the issue. Just like what happened with baby harp seal products, same thing. When about 4 or 5 countries banned baby harp seal products, the EU had to address it, and now there is an EU ban on baby harp seal products. If, and I think we can, in the next 2 or 3 years, get a ban on kangaroo products into the EU, collapse.
Wow.
Because Woolworths and Coles will look at what Europe has done. They didn't want to take much notice of Russia. They would look at what Europe's done, and it would be very embarrassing and an outrage for them to continue accepting kangaroo meat. So then the industry, if we can bring it to collapse, and at the same time these debates about what are we going to do, so what's going to then happen to all those kangaroos that aren't going to be shot commercially? That's the next question.
We can love this.
What was your experience in Europe when you went there? How did people respond to?
Well, this is why I talked about it. I think it's the same issue with Australian people. You show the picture.
And they're horrified.
They're horrified. So so there hasn't been an industry, there hasn't been a mechanism that Australia has developed in Europe to cover that up. They told them they were farmed. They told them that kangaroos were farmed, put up onto the truck and sent to slaughter. So they just lied to them about what really happened. So we went there and told them, no, they're wild animals and there are all these problems that occurred. So it's the same issue. So with our colleagues from other political parties, when we showed the pictures, then they committed to, because they know they can do something to help this issue. So that's
So
That's
it's
the great thing.
information, really, being exposed to reality. What
That's right. And
happens.
maybe it means we find purses to run 30-second ads during news time and prime time on TV saying, did you know, blah. You know, maybe that's trying to turn this mindset around. It's happened with mulesing, it's happened with battery cages, sow stalls. We can do it for kangaroos.
Dan, why would you get scientists who would oppose this? Are they in the pocket of industry, or is it a genuine disagreement?
I mean, I think debate is healthy. I mean, I think that, you know, what is truth? The fact of the matter is, though, that when I'm out there, I see kangaroos suffering. And not just the ones being killed, but the ones that are left. And so I now have PhD students out there trying to say, well, how can we work out what their quality of life is? In areas where there's heavy persecution, we don't see young at foot out and about very much. So they stay in the pouch. In areas where they feel safer.
So they're responding to this.
Oh, absolutely.
Fear.
You know, there's
Fear,
there's
right.
stress. So one of the things that we're working on in our group is ways, no one's really looked at how do you measure the welfare and well-being of a wild animal. The focus has always been on domesticated
Right. Yeah. Good
animals
point.
or livestock. The welfare of wild animals has been really lost. And I actually have a PhD student in the audience who's pioneering this in developing new ways to quantify this, collaborating globally, so that we can then be quantitative rather than just saying, well, and because you do need methods, you need to be able to, we can't speak to them, but they're thinking things and we need to work out what those things are. And when I'm out there, I see them having a terrible time. And there are some already anecdotal evidence that some kangaroos that have been where their mums have been killed in collisions and they've been rehabilitated, there's some indications that these animals might be suffering something akin to PTSD.
PTSD, I was going to ask about that.
But I mean, there's a lot of research that needs doing, but for the most part, mainstream science is ignoring it because of the entrenched, you know, that's the way that paradigms work, that it's very entrenched. It's very hard to say, well, I want to try something different. And in fact, of the scientists that I know of that are trying to do things differently, there's almost bullying from the other scientists. And that's very real.
So I often get the impression that many scientists are, well, captured might be not a polite word, but that money comes from industry. Therefore, there is a closeness to industry. Is that fair?
I don't feel qualified to comment. I haven't looked at some of those scientists and what kinds of grants they've been getting.
Right.
There's strong associations. Whether or not whether or not it's personal or whether it's financial for research, I don't know. There is certainly some programs that have been, I'm aware of some programs that have definitely been driven by that premise. And when science, I mean, science isn't objective, it's subjective. So when you set out to ask a particular question, you do so within the framework of whatever paradigm or ideology that you have. And I guess most of the science that's focused on kangaroos has been within a particular mindset that's already accepted that they're pests and how can we deal with this problem. The research that we're doing is just saying, how can we enable these animals to lead quality lives in amongst people and their needs. So it's not putting them above people's needs, but it's just saying, how can we coexist, cohabit? And that's something that humans do very badly.
I think there's another interesting issue is that when I went on with Draw and others on a trip out in the outback, there was, after we'd done some research and taking samples from carcasses in the chillers, because as you know, the kangaroos are hung in chillers in small towns at the edges of the town, the industrial area, poor area. And you drive around the town and every third house would have a truck with the hooks on, which is where they go shooting and that sort of thing. Anyhow, so we went looking for the chiller operator to ask them some questions and to access the chiller. And he was asleep upstairs, but we ended up talking to the grandmother, mother and daughter who were in a pool. It was very hot. And they said, we hate the killing of kangaroos. We hate the violence that this town, the violence that has come to this town since kangaroo killing has started.
Wow.
And then talked about if they're not killing kangaroos, their asses hanging out of their pants, so they go and work at the abattoir. And then the other part of the paradigm is the prison. So there's this culture, it's connected, and I think if there was an analysis done of it, and I think this will help our cause, is what's happening in these towns where there's this culture of almost enshrined going out and killing animals and then working at an abattoir. This all coming together is a culture of violence. I think it'd be worthwhile analysing that.
There's a huge amount of research now in the United States and in Europe of serial killers who almost to a person have a history of animal abuse.
Start with animals.
And of course, what happens in these areas where they have abattoirs is these people are, they have 100% turnover every year because such a horrible job. And the amount of spousal abuse and abuse within the family is just horrendous. And that's only recently. I mean, I think we need a paradigm shift, as you said, with PTSD. Look, up until a few years ago, nobody could imagine that elephants could experience PTSD. But they do.
Definitely.
As Gay Bradshaw has shown in her work on elephants on the edge, when these male elephants went out in South Africa and were raping and murdering rhinoceroses, which had never been seen, and finally they looked at it and realized these were the very animals that had seen their mothers slaughtered in front of them and had escaped and were completely devoid of elephant culture. They didn't know what to do. They became killers. And I wonder what happens to kangaroo, what happens to a joey who sees his mother. Of course, they're not an aggressive animal, so they don't harm us, but they must suffer horrendously for the rest of their lives if they survive.
We're still collecting information on this, so it's active research. But we are finding very stark differences between different mobs, and not just populations of one population of what we might consider one population might contain many different family groups, and they each have their own different kinds of culture, if you like. And there are some very stark differences that we're starting to see, but it's early days. We certainly think that that's important. I guess I just wanted to add to that the communities that I'm working with, it's very brutal to live on the land, and shooting and poisoning is very much entrenched. But it's also entrenched if you're a landholder. So if landholders get requests by other members of the community to come on every weekend and go pig dogging, or which again is another brutal issue that we have to...
What is?
So they go pig hunting, but they do it with knives and dogs. It's brutal for the pigs, it's brutal for the dogs. But there's this culture where they can't say no. So the communities themselves are stuck in a pattern of violence, and we need to help them. We need not tell them off. We need to help them, and so that's the kind of approach that we're doing. And I believe that good attitudes towards kangaroos will come by a redirection of that cultural attitude towards...
So what would be some of the things, the positive things? I mean, coming as an outsider, it was so exciting to go to Bathurst and actually see them. It was such a wonderful... I could imagine that every tourist would love to see them. And
including the Russians.
Pardon?
Including the Russians who never saw one.
I mean, is that
tourism? Yeah, so tourism's a no-brainer.
Tourism, sure. Like as whale watching, look at that.
In fact, the research has been done on it. It's a totally viable industry. We have farm stays. Why not wild stays?
Sure.
Even when I get international visitors coming to the centre to do research or whatever, they go, "Where can we go and see kangaroos?" And you have to go, "Well, you've got to go a few hundred kilometres," and they look incredulous at you. Really? Yeah. As you
don't want to see them in a compound. You want to see them in their natural environment. At safaris, kangaroo safaris. Wouldn't that be? Yeah. How about changing the language? Maybe I'm wrong, but the word mob has a terrible,
Never?
it resonates badly. Oh
No,
God,
in
don't go
Australia-
outside, there's a mob of young males out there and they will get you. Why do they call them mobs?
That's interesting, actually. I hadn't actually thought of that.
Yeah, although...
Not a nice word, a mob.
No, but Aboriginal people call themselves a mob.
They
And it's
do.
actually got a...
Well, but it's not an Aboriginal word, is it?
No, but I would say, and people correct me if I'm wrong, I see it used quite differently here, within a softer collective way of how you
So
describe
it's a positive word?
Yeah,
Yes,
it would be
yes.
Definitely
Wow.
used differently, but where it originally came
I
from.
belong to that mob.
Yeah.
You know,
Really?
that
Yes.
would-
It's like
would
that lot, you lot.
Oh no, we wouldn't
No?
say lot. That'd be worse.
No, that's
So,
English,
You
yeah,
mob.
but-
You know.
Yeah, okay, so it's just my...
Foreigners coming out here.
Yeah, telling us what words to use. Okay,
Invaders.
mob is positive, I'll remember that, okay.
But I remember it was an interesting. In kangaroo
Communal, okay,
kangaroo
yeah.
shooters have spoken to me about what they've seen when they first contacted me, and they were concerned about zones being shot at by weekend shooters and themselves as professional shooters every night and never being left alone to rest. So what they would see would be kangaroos, that the integrity of the mob, the level of emotional state of the mob deteriorate every night, where they're all running around and jittery and actually hiding with their young behind trees to be in the shadow of the light. So you're dead right, there's this dreadful trauma and assault that they were experiencing or are experiencing every night, and they feel it. But the shooters were seeing it and worried about it, actually.
Yeah.
But I was just going to suggest we might go to questions and discussion from the audience.
How do you...
Going a good hour,
yeah.
I think.